Jasmine Crockett discovered that U.S. federal judges were secretly editing court rulings based on scripts written by political lobbyists. Her revelation shook the justice system to its core, triggering chaos in courtrooms across the country. She was hacked, discredited, and nearly stripped of her license for speaking out. But what exactly did Jasmine expose that made those in power desperate to silence her? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under gray skies and beneath the looming architecture of the Chicago Federal Courthouse, a storm was gathering, one not of weather, but of power. Jasmine Crockett, known across the country as a relentless civil rights attorney and defender of the voiceless, stepped out of a black SUV flanked by silence and a single, determined purpose. She wasn't scheduled to speak that morning. She was scheduled to be judged. Accused of defying a federal court order, she was being dragged into a legal firestorm for intervening in the deportation of dozens of Venezuelan asylum seekers. But to Jasmine, they weren't cases or delays. They were people, terrified, begging for a chance. Inside, the atmosphere thickened with tension. Cameras tracked her every step. Politicians whispered behind closed doors. And on the judge's bench, Richard Alden waited, the symbol of a system many believed had forgotten how to feel. Alden wasn't just a judge. He was a machine in a robe, cold, precise, a man with a long history of rulings that always seemed to favor structure over soul. He had once ruled against a pregnant refugee seeking shelter during a Category 4 hurricane because protocol hadn't been followed. His presence in this case wasn't accidental. It was strategic. Jasmine, on the other hand, had become a lightning rod, praised by some as the conscience of American law, vilified by others as a threat to institutional order. And now the institution was ready to strike back. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, aides, even retired judges sat stiffly, waiting for the first blow to land. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood tall, alone at the defense table, wearing the calm, not of resignation, but of readiness. Today, she wasn't just on trial. Justice itself was. Under the unforgiving glow of courtroom lights, Judge Richard Alden leaned forward, his voice slicing through the stillness like a blade. "Ms. Crockett," he began, eyes narrowing with the weight of institutional authority, "you knowingly exceeded the boundaries of your legal role. This court issued a direct federal order, and you chose to disregard it." His tone was cold, calculated. Each word delivered like a scalpel, meant not only to accuse but to humiliate. You interfered with a deportation proceeding that was fully sanctioned under federal law. You had no jurisdiction, no standing, no permission. Around the courtroom, pens stopped moving. Breath was held. And yet, you took it upon yourself to obstruct enforcement officers and delay a flight for nearly 22 hours. He continued, his voice rising slightly. You acted as if your personal conviction could override the rule of law. Jasmine stood motionless, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. But inside she could feel it. The system had already written her guilt in ink. The air in the courtroom hung heavy, like the seconds before a thunderclap. Judge Alden had just finished painting her as reckless, defiant, and dangerous. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to plead, to fold, or to apologize. She took a slow breath, her hands resting calmly on the edge of the table, her voice low, but with the precision of a blade. You accuse me of disrespecting this court, she began, locking eyes with Alden. But I'm not the one disrespecting justice. The room went still again, as if everyone could feel what was about to come. Let's be honest. This isn't just about me delaying a deportation. This is about what happens when someone dares to question the machinery, when someone refuses to let a process built on silence run uninterrupted. Her voice rose, not in volume but in force. You call it defiance, I call it decency. Because when people are being loaded onto planes without legal representation, without a hearing, without even someone to say their name in court, what exactly are we defending here? She stepped fully forward now, into the spotlight that had been built to burn her down, and turned it into a pulpit. Your Honor, she said with chilling clarity, we both know this courtroom doesn't exist in a vacuum. We both know the rulings that come from this bench echo beyond these walls, and we both know certain voices are louder in your chambers than others. A few gasps escaped from the gallery. One reporter's pen stopped mid-sentence. There are patterns, she continued, eyes never leaving Alden. Petitions submitted, denied, delayed, always favoring one side. Always in sync with briefs from outside groups with political goals and donor lists longer than their moral codes. The judge shifted in his seat. So no, Jasmine said, voice steady and full of fire. I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to say what no one else will say in this room. And then she delivered the line that would go viral before the session even ended. The law cannot be a shield for the man sitting on the throne. It must be a weapon for the ones at his feet. The room didn't react immediately. It froze. Every breath held. Every thought stopped. Alden sat motionless, caught between fury and calculation. The silence was deafening, because it wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. A courtroom designed to shame her had become a witness stand for the system itself. Journalists stared wide-eyed. One assistant dropped a folder without realizing it. And far in the back, someone, just one person, started to quietly clap before stopping, remembering where they were. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just stood there unflinching, as if daring the entire system to say she was wrong. And in that moment, no one could. The tension hadn't just returned, it had thickened, tightening like a noose around every person seated in courtroom 7B. Jasmine Crockett stood in the eye of that storm, not as a victim of it, but as the one steering it. Her words still echoed in the air, but this time, she didn't let the silence settle. No delay, no hesitation. She reached into her briefcase. The metallic snap of the latch echoed like a warning shot. Then came the envelope, manila, thin, but more dangerous than a loaded weapon. A single blue sticker on the flap read, "Confidential, verified." She held it up with calm precision, as if she was holding the verdict itself. All around her, the room seemed to hold its breath. The judge's expression didn't change, but his posture did. He leaned forward, alert, defensive. Jasmine turned, her tone steady, voice cold as steel. "Since I've been accused of undermining this court," she began, "let's talk about what's really been happening behind those chambers." She walked forward and placed the envelope on the clerk's desk, her movements exact and unshakable. Inside is a sworn affidavit, signed, dated, filed by Cameron West. She paused just long enough to let the name register. "He worked in your office, Judge Alden, for 4 years. The judge blinked once. Jasmine didn't. "He saw everything," she continued. "He watched legal briefs from a so-called nonprofit, Justice Horizon, land on your desk before they were even filed in court. He saw you review them, edit them, send back comments." The gallery shifted. Shocked murmurs swept across the rows like rising smoke. He didn't want to believe what he saw, but then he noticed something worse. Your rulings started using the exact language from those secret drafts, word for word. Alden opened his mouth to interrupt, but Jasmine didn't give him the chance. "This isn't speculation," she said, her voice rising with each word. "This is evidence, emails, drafts, internal memos, and your own initials, signed on edits that were never supposed to exist." Her hand hovered above the envelope. "This isn't about politics. It's not even about me. It's about you, a federal judge secretly coordinating with outside interests to steer the outcome of legal decisions while pretending the bench is neutral." She took a step closer to the bench. "And I'm not going to sit here and be lectured about respecting the law by someone who broke it before I even walked into this courtroom." The air cracked with tension. For a moment, it seemed even the walls were listening. Alden's voice came out colder now, but thinner. "This is a disgraceful ambush, Miss Crockett," he said. "You're not here to practice law. You're staging a circus." But Jasmine didn't flinch. Her voice didn't tremble. She looked him dead in the eye. "No, Your Honor," she fired back. "This isn't a circus. It's a spotlight, and I'm pointing it right where it belongs." The clerk didn't dare touch the envelope. Reporters were already typing, whispering, capturing every word. The name Cameron West had landed like a bomb. Jasmine pressed forward. "He left your office in silence. No press, no lawsuit. Just the truth, and this affidavit." He tried to raise it quietly. He was ignored, pushed out. So now I'm here to make sure his voice is finally heard. She faced the gallery again, louder now. Because when people like Cameron stay silent, this system rots. But when they speak, it panics. Alden's face had turned hard as stone, but his silence betrayed the pressure. Jasmine turned back to him. Her voice dropped, quieter but sharper. You abused this bench. You turned your robe into armor for political favors. And the people paying the price weren't in chambers with you. They were in holding cells, in airport terminals. On deportation lists, another beat. Then she added, "Don't worry, Your Honor. This time there's a paper trail." Reporters were out of their seats. Phones lit up like wildfire. One assistant U.S. Marshal shifted his stance. The moment had turned. Jasmine stood taller now, not just as a defense attorney, but as a witness, a messenger, a spark. "File this into the record," she told the clerk, "and prepare for an investigation, because the courtroom isn't yours anymore. It belongs to the truth now." Jasmine's final words still echoed in the charged silence, but she said nothing more. She didn't need to. The courtroom was no longer under his control. It was under scrutiny, and for a man who'd ruled with absolute authority for decades, that realization landed like a punch to the ribs. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Alden reached for his gavel. But this time, there was no conviction in the motion, just damage control. He cleared his throat, voice brittle. "This court will enter immediate recess pending review of the submitted document." No elaboration, no dismissal instructions. He stood quickly, almost too quickly, his black robe sweeping behind him like a curtain closing on a collapsing act. Then he turned and walked through the side exit, head high but spine tight, like a man carrying the weight of exposure on his shoulders. He didn't look at Jasmine. He couldn't. And in that instant, everything changed. The room detonated, not with violence, but with voices. The gallery broke into a chorus of shock, disbelief, and barely controlled chaos. Reporters scrambled to their feet, ripping notepads from bags, thrusting recorders into the air. The clack of keyboards sounded like a machine gun. Phones were already dialing into newsroom switchboards. "We need a satellite truck now. Judge Alden just recessed without rebuttal." "Confirmed affidavit. Confidential seal. Source, former court staffer." She dropped a bomb in there, live. The words spread faster than wildfire, spilling out of the courtroom and into the veins of the media machine waiting outside. Jasmine remained still. She didn't flinch. She didn't move to leave. Her hands stayed at her sides and her expression didn't change. Because she knew this moment wasn't about noise. It was about the shift beneath the noise. The kind of shift you can't see but feel in your bones. A courtroom built to control people had just lost control of itself. And the ones used to pulling the strings were now realizing the strings had snapped. In the hallway, security tightened. Marshals exchanged looks, unsure whether to intervene or stand back. The court clerk, visibly shaken, clutched the manila envelope like it contained something radioactive. A legal assistant near the doors whispered. She flipped the courtroom. "I've never seen anything like that. Not ever." Inside the media pen just outside the building, reporters were shouting into cameras. "Breaking news out of Chicago, civil rights attorney Jasmine Crockett has just forced the abrupt suspension of a federal hearing after submitting a whistleblower affidavit implicating Judge Richard Alden in potential judicial misconduct." Microphones swarmed toward the exit like vultures scenting blood. Jasmine stepped out a moment later, not flanked by a team of spin doctors or armed security, just Rebecca, her co-counsel, and the silence of a woman who had just faced down the machine and made it stutter. The second her foot touched the top step, the crowd surged. "Ms. Crockett, do you have evidence the judge violated ethics protocol? Is the affidavit authentic? Did Alden tamper with rulings? Are you accusing the federal judiciary of corruption?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush to the cameras. Instead, she said one thing, measured, firm, unforgettable. "I'm not accusing anyone. I submitted proof. There's a difference." The crowd erupted again, but Jasmine was already moving down the stairs. Within 15 minutes, her name had hit the news cycle. Headlines screamed across the screens. Federal judge abruptly recesses after explosive filing. Whistleblower accuses Alden of back-channel brief shaping. Jasmine Crockett drops legal bombshell in live hearing. It was inescapable. On every screen, every feed. Legal analysts were cutting into their segments. Commentators scrambled to reframe the narrative. Alden's decades-long record was being torn open like a vault. Cable news flashed side-by-side photos of Jasmine in court and Alden stepping off the bench. One anchor said it plainly. This isn't just a dramatic moment in one courtroom. This could unravel trust in judicial neutrality across the country. But for Jasmine, the media frenzy was noise on the edge of a much deeper war. Because while cameras captured the fallout, she understood what she just touched. A system that doesn't just protect itself, it retaliates. She knew what came next. Calls to discredit, leaks to distract. Legal threats designed not to win, but to exhaust. Yet she also knew this. There was no walking backward through that door. Not after what she'd just done. Not after showing the public that even a courtroom, sacred, solemn, untouchable, could be infected by silent deals behind closed doors. And somewhere, Judge Alden sat alone in his private chambers, staring at the envelope now being copied by court staff under federal oversight. For the first time in his career, he wasn't issuing orders. He was waiting for one. And Jasmine? She wasn't waiting for anything. She was already preparing for the next round. Because today, the truth cracked through marble. Bunyiron, ngoy gyu luat bi, jutra. The moment Judge Alden stepped off the bench, the story stopped being just legal. It became political. And within hours, the Department of Justice confirmed what everyone suspected. An official investigation had been launched into potential judicial misconduct involving Alden and outside influence from the nonprofit organization Justice Horizon. At first, the statement was dry, clinical language, cautious tone, carefully worded. But behind the scenes, the engine was already roaring. Federal investigators submitted emergency subpoenas for digital records, pulling server access logs, archived emails, metadata from court-issued devices, and financial disclosure statements tied to Alden and his former clerks. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Emails between Alden's office and Justice Horizon legal strategists were recovered. Some marked time-sensitive alignment, others early draft feedback. Keep internal. Internal court memos were flagged where key phrases used in Alden's rulings mirrored those submitted by outside advocacy groups, well before any official filing date. And then came the real trigger, financial reports showing that a side foundation affiliated with Justice Horizon had deposited over $75,000 in consulting fees to a political advisory firm operated by Alden's former law clerk. It wasn't just smoke, it was fire, and it was spreading fast. But as the evidence grew, so did the counterattack. The backlash against Jasmine Crockett began with whispers, then sharpened into a campaign. Commentators flooded the airwaves. Pundits who'd once praised her courtroom skill now called her reckless. Headlines pivoted. They didn't say whistleblower, they said agitator. Nighttime talk shows spliced footage of her courtroom confrontation with ominous music, calling her performance a political ambush disguised as justice. A senior senator appeared on cable news and said flatly, "This kind of spectacle undermines public trust in our courts." Political blogs picked up an old student activist clip of Jasmine speaking at a protest 15 years earlier. She was 19, standing on a folding chair, shouting into a megaphone, "Burn it all down if it was never built for us." Taken out of context, it now ran on a loop, painted as her true agenda. On one channel, a commentator said, "She's not trying to save the law, she's trying to dismantle it." The labels came quickly. Radical, firebrand, system breaker, media opportunist. They didn't come for her evidence. They came for her character, for her voice, for the fact that a black woman had stepped into a courtroom and pointed a finger directly at the system itself. Some anchors didn't even try to hide their contempt. "Who does she think she is?" one sneered. "A defense attorney doesn't get to decide what a judge does behind closed doors." The attacks weren't just media-driven. She started receiving anonymous calls. A brick was thrown through the window of the law clinic where she volunteered. Donors threatened to pull funding from civil rights nonprofits that had once supported her. Quiet pressure, strategic silence, coordinated pushback. The message was clear. Stay in your lane. But Jasmine didn't back down. She didn't hide. She didn't wait for a PR firm to handle the storm. 3 nights after the smear campaign peaked, she walked into a primetime broadcast studio, alone, without handlers, without preconditions, and sat across from one of the toughest anchors on television. It wasn't a puff interview. It was an interrogation. But Jasmine was ready. When asked if she regretted blowing up a federal courtroom, she responded with surgical calm. I didn't blow anything up. I revealed what was already broken. The anchor pressed harder. People are saying you're dangerous, that you've compromised judicial neutrality by going public. Jasmine's eyes locked on the camera. Her voice dropped, slow, controlled, unmistakably clear. Justice doesn't exist to protect the reputations of men in robes. It exists to protect people who don't have power, don't have lawyers, don't have cameras watching. And if the truth threatens their comfort, then maybe they were never holding justice, just control. Justice cannot be censored by fear, not in my courtroom, not in this country. The studio went quiet. The control room froze. Seconds later, Twitter lit up like a power grid. Clips of her statement spread across social media, racking up millions of views in hours. Hashtags exploded. Justice, not fear, Crockett. Truth, who judges the judge. Civil rights leaders praised her. Law students quoted her. Even a handful of former federal clerks, quietly and carefully, began signaling support. But Jasmine didn't celebrate. She knew better. This wasn't vindication. This was resistance. What she'd done had triggered something far deeper than headlines. She'd peeled back the curtain on a legal system that many feared to question. She wasn't the only target anymore. The truth was, and once exposed, it doesn't go back into the envelope. It only spreads. And Jasmine? She would rather stand alone in truth than be welcomed in silence. The truth, once set loose, didn't crawl. It ran. Less than 72 hours after Jasmine Crockett's national interview, the Department of Justice issued a second, far more pointed announcement. Judge Richard Alden had been placed on immediate administrative suspension, pending the outcome of the ongoing investigation. This time, the language wasn't careful. It wasn't veiled in diplomacy. It cited credible allegations of ethical violations, improper communications with advocacy organizations, and potential interference with the impartial exercise of federal judicial duties. The order was signed by the Office of the Inspector General, approved by the Chief Circuit Judge, and executed without delay. No ceremony, no warning. Just a knock on the judge's private chamber's door, and 2 U.S. Marshals waiting on the other side. They didn't come in shouting. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was the siren. Alden, still in his robe, had been reviewing a docket for the next week's session. He never got to finish it. The senior marshal read from a folder, voice neutral but sharp. By federal order, your duties are suspended, effective immediately. You are to step away from the bench. All official access is revoked. Please surrender any and all personal devices used in connection with your office. For the first time in decades, Alden didn't speak. He didn't question the order. He didn't bark a legal defense. He simply stared. At the document, at the marshals, at the career slipping through his fingers like sand. He reached into the top drawer of his desk and slowly removed a black phone, a court-issued laptop, and a single external hard drive. One of the marshals stepped forward with a padded evidence case. No one said a word as Alden placed each item inside, the clicks of the clasps echoing like nails into the coffin of his authority. Then came the moment that sealed it, when the younger marshal, barely 30, reached over and removed Alden's access badge from his lapel. It had been clipped there for 20 years. He had walked into hundreds of courtrooms with that badge. Now he would never wear it again. Across the city, news alerts flashed with surgical speed. Breaking. Judge Richard Alden suspended amid DOJ probe. Federal marshals seized judicial devices in Chicago. Sources confirm financial records and private email logs, now in federal custody. Cameras swarmed the federal building within minutes. Helicopters hovered overhead. Protesters gathered by noon, some demanding deeper investigation, others defending the judge they claimed was being sacrificed for politics. But no one really knew what had snapped the system's silence. Jasmine did. From her office, Jasmine watched the live coverage on mute, her eyes focused, her fingers still. She didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no cheering, just a stillness, like standing in the quiet after an explosion, waiting for the smoke to settle and see what's left. Rebecca, seated nearby, broke the silence. "It happened," she said, voice low. Jasmine nodded. "It was supposed to," she replied. "The question is, what happens now?" Because Jasmine knew too well that removing one man from power didn't fix the machine he helped build. Alden was a symbol, but he wasn't alone, and symbols don't fall without a fight. Already, unnamed sources close to the bench were leaking to media, pushing back. Rumors circulated that Alden would mount a vigorous defense. One op-ed referred to the suspension as a dangerous overreach, driven by media hysteria and activist sabotage. They didn't mention Jasmine by name, but everyone knew who they were talking about. She wasn't just the whistleblower's ally now. She was the accelerant. Meanwhile, inside Alden's now vacant office, federal agents worked like surgeons. Cabinets were unlocked, filing systems combed, password-protected folders decrypted by forensic techs. At 3:42 p.m., one agent discovered a private USB drive stored behind a false panel in the bottom drawer. Inside were drafts, documents bearing edits and feedback from outside parties who had no legal standing in the cases they touched. The timeline matched the rulings Jasmine had challenged. The implications were nuclear. Still, outside in the public arena, the narrative war raged. One conservative news anchor opened his segment with, "So a judge made a few calls, looked at a few drafts. That's not corruption, it's consultation. But now a radical lawyer with a camera and a microphone thinks she gets to rewrite the rules." But Jasmine wasn't playing defense. That night she appeared again on live television. This time the background was a plain black curtain, no lights, no glamour, just her voice, just the facts. Judge Alden wore a robe, yes. But what he wrapped in that robe wasn't justice. It was protection, for influence, for deals made in the dark. "I didn't put him on trial. He did that himself the moment he opened the door to people who don't speak in court, but speak in his inbox. And now the system has to decide if it has the courage to finish what it started." By the time she finished speaking, the screen behind her displayed a simple banner: a federal judge suspended, a system exposed. What comes next? And across the country, millions were asking the same thing. The political temperature in Washington had reached a boiling point. The DOJ investigation was still unfolding, but Congress could no longer afford to wait. The evidence was too explosive, the public pressure too fierce, and the system too exposed to keep operating in silence. And so, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, a bipartisan Senate Oversight Committee called for an emergency judicial ethics hearing, public, live-streamed, and nationally broadcast. It wasn't just about Judge Alden anymore. It was about trust, about whether Americans could still walk into a courtroom and believe that justice wasn't already bought, edited, or scheduled. And sitting at the top of the witness list, the name in bold black print, Jasmine Crockett. She arrived without an entourage, without makeup artists or message consultants. No one briefed her at the last minute. She didn't need it. Jasmine walked into the Capitol that morning like she had into the courtroom weeks earlier, measured, composed, and ready to face a machine built to silence people like her. As she stepped through the grand marble rotunda, camera crews followed every movement. Reporters whispered her name, and security flanked the corridor. But none of it fazed her. The corridors of power had tried to discredit her, drown her in noise, and paint her as the problem. But none of it had stuck, because the truth had landed, and now power had no choice but to listen. Inside the Senate hearing room, the mood was taut. The air conditioning hummed beneath the static of tension. Senators from both parties sat in elevated positions, some with notepads in front of them, others with posture stiff as stone. The room was full: law clerks, DOJ representatives, press, even 2 former judges. The chair banged the gavel once. "This committee is now in session. Ms. Crockett, please approach." She stood without hesitation and walked to the center seat at the long witness table. Her oath was short and clean. Her hand didn't shake. She sat down and folded her hands once the microphone lit red. The questioning began as expected, measured, political, and cautiously neutral. Ms. Crockett, can you confirm when you first received the affidavit from Mr. Cameron West? Did you notify law enforcement before going public? What was your intent in confronting Judge Alden during a live proceeding? Jasmine answered directly, never flinching. She wasn't there to be clever. She was there to be clear. But it wasn't until the third round of questions that the moment came. A senior senator leaned forward, fingertips pressed together, voice lower than the others. Ms. Crockett, if you had to say who was most impacted by this scandal, not politically but personally, who would that be? Jasmine paused, and for the first time, the room truly quieted. Not because they were waiting for drama, but because they sensed something real was coming. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. This isn't about me. This isn't about headlines. This is about the people who were never heard. The father who got deported without a hearing because someone edited a ruling before it was filed. The woman who begged for her asylum case to be reopened and got a templated denial that matched a draft sent weeks earlier by a third-party group. The people whose cases weren't just delayed. They were decided before they even arrived. That's who I'm speaking for today. The ones who were judged without ever being seen. The ones this building was supposed to protect. A hush rolled over the chamber. No interruptions, no rebuttals, just silence. Jasmine's voice had filled the room with something rare in congressional hearings. Truth that didn't need to be translated. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't perform. She just spoke, and the system had no option but to listen. The senators shifted in their seats, some visibly affected. One leaned back and exhaled quietly. Even the committee chair took a few seconds before responding. Thank you, Ms. Crockett. That will be entered into the record. She nodded once, stood, and stepped away from the microphone. No applause, no theatrics, just gravity. Outside, the Capitol steps had become a media circus. Reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, floodlights humming, boom mics overhead. They were all waiting. They expected her to give a statement, to step into the spotlight she had earned. But Jasmine didn't stop. She walked straight down the steps, past the cameras, past the noise, past the temptation to make the moment about herself. Her eyes didn't dart. Her stride didn't break. Flash bulbs went off like machine gun fire, and voices shouted questions rapid fire. But she said nothing, because this wasn't her victory to claim. This wasn't about profile or power. It was about those who had never been allowed inside these halls, never seen the inside of a courtroom that treated them as equals, never been given the dignity of being heard. And as she disappeared into the crowd, no entourage, no announcement, no speech, she left behind not silence, but a space where accountability had finally begun. Not because a system allowed it, but because a single voice refused to be quiet. The fall of Judge Alden sent shockwaves through the legal world, but what came next was even more seismic. With mounting public pressure and evidence too damning to ignore, Congress convened a high-level hearing to address systemic failures in judicial ethics and influence. It wasn't just about Alden anymore. It was about the cracks he'd revealed, cracks that led into courtrooms across the country. And at the center of it all, called to testify not as a lawyer, but as a witness to the truth, was Jasmine Crockett. Her name appeared first on the hearing schedule, above sitting judges, legal scholars, and former DOJ officials. The committee chamber was full. Senators lined the dais, cameras lined the walls, and outside, barricades held back hundreds who'd come to watch history tilt on its axis. Jasmine entered through the East Wing entrance of the Capitol, not flanked by security or aides, but walking alone, her heels tapping the marble floor like a drumbeat. The room quieted when she stepped in. Reporters whispered. A few aides paused mid-note. She didn't wear a bright color or a symbolic pin, just a black suit, sharp and simple. No distractions, only resolve. When she was sworn in, her voice didn't shake. She raised her right hand with the same composure she'd shown in court and took her seat at the witness table without glancing at a single camera. The opening questions came quickly. Do you believe Judge Alden acted with intent? Were you politically motivated? Did you seek media attention? Jasmine answered each one with clarity, never defensive, never evasive. But then came the moment that defined it all. A senator leaned forward, voice quieter than the rest. Ms. Crockett, in your view, who was harmed the most in all of this? Jasmine paused, not for effect, but for weight. Then she spoke. The people who were supposed to be heard, but never were. The immigrant mother deported before her asylum claim was processed. The teenager whose case was dismissed before he even got a lawyer. The families who came to court expecting fairness and found a script already written. That's who I'm here for. I didn't come to speak about myself. I came to speak for the people who were judged before they were even seen. The room went silent, not out of courtesy, but because there was nothing left to say. No grandstanding, no political spin, just truth, heavy and unmoving. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her testimony wasn't loud. It was seismic. And every word landed with the weight of someone who had not just seen injustice, but refused to walk away from it. After 2 hours of questioning, Jasmine stood, thanked the committee, and walked out the way she came. Quiet, unshaken, deliberate. Outside, the Capitol was swallowed in a forest of microphones and floodlights. Reporters surged, shouting her name. Flashes exploded. Questions flew from every angle. But she didn't stop to answer. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't smile. Jasmine simply walked through the chaos with her head held high, her face calm, her eyes forward, like someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to protect. Because for her, it was never about recognition, never about revenge. It was about restoring something that had been taken from people too powerless to get it back on their own. And in that moment, under the harsh lights of a nation watching, Jasmine Crockett walked out of the Capitol not as a headline, but as a reckoning. The echo of Jasmine Crockett's closing statement was still circling headlines when the silence shattered once again. This time not by testimony, but by a leak. It started as a whisper, a quiet tip to a mid-tier legal journalist in D.C. Then came the file, an audio clip. No watermark, no flashy editing, just a conversation, clean and chilling. Within hours, it was confirmed, a voice print-matched, time-stamped, authenticated recording between Judge Richard Alden and a senior legislative counsel from the Senate Judiciary Committee. What followed wasn't speculation. It was a sentence. 9 words that blew the door off everything Jasmine had spent weeks trying to expose. You write the law, I'll back the ruling. The voice was Alden's. Unmistakable. Calm. Almost bored. He spoke like someone who'd made that arrangement more than once. It wasn't a joke, it wasn't a misquote, it was a deal. The exchange took place in a Senate office, off hours, just weeks before Alden's controversial opinion on asylum processing delays. And now, that quiet, smoky deal was public, and the entire legal system had to answer for it. By morning, the nation was on fire. Newsrooms dropped scheduled programming. Radio stations opened lines. Every headline screamed the same thing in different ways. A judge for sale, audio links court to Congress. The sentence that shattered separation of powers. You write the law, leaked recording rocks Supreme Bench. Social media ignited. Hashtags trended for 12 hours straight. Rigged Justice Alden tapes law for hire. Commentators shouted over each other on cable news. Former clerks and retired judges were dragged into emergency interviews. Think tanks issued midnight statements demanding reform. But the most staggering response came from inside the government. At 9:47 a.m., the Speaker of the House issued a rare bipartisan call for a congressional emergency ethics session, effective immediately. Senators scrambled. Staffers were called back from recess. Doors that hadn't opened in a decade swung wide. No one could defend it, not out loud, not even those who had looked the other way for years. Because this time, there was no room for narrative. There was tape. The committee chamber was a standing room only. Senior lawmakers looked like they hadn't slept. Some hadn't. One senator, red-eyed and furious, slammed his palm on the table. A federal judge offering to pre-approve rulings in exchange for political cooperation? We're not talking about corruption anymore. We're talking about conspiracy. Behind the microphone, staffers rushed to prepare exhibits. Transcripts of the recording were already in everyone's hands, highlighted and time-stamped. Jasmine's affidavit from weeks earlier, once considered aggressive, even speculative, was now being reread like prophecy. Everything she said had been dismissed as exaggeration. Now it was a roadmap. Outside the building, the public swelled. Hundreds lined the steps holding handwritten signs. Justice should not be negotiated. This system failed us. She didn't. You write the law, we'll rewrite the system. Reporters shouted updates live from the Capitol lawn. Aerial camera crews hovered above. And somewhere, deep within the Department of Justice, officials moved to freeze all Alden-authored rulings under active review. In the midst of the storm, Jasmine remained silent. She didn't tweet. She didn't grant interviews. She stayed inside her modest office with the blinds drawn, watching the country confront what she had seen all along. Her phone buzzed with messages from senators, attorneys, strangers, but she ignored most of them. Not because she didn't care, but because she knew the storm wasn't the end. It was the start of something much harder. Because buried under the fury, beneath the headlines and hashtags, was the deeper truth. A judge had bartered justice in exchange for legislation. And worse, he had done it comfortably, like a man who believed the system wouldn't care, because maybe it never had. Jasmine didn't need to say it. The tape said it for her, loud, clear, and irreversible. It came like a wave, not of applause or recognition, but of calculated sabotage. Jasmine Crockett had survived the courtroom, the committee chamber, and the firestorm of public scrutiny. But power, when threatened, doesn't retreat, it retaliates. And it came quietly at first. A login attempt here, an unknown IP address there. Then in the span of 72 hours, the full weight of the backlash revealed itself. Her personal email was hacked. Her law firm's internal server crashed. Private messages were leaked, some real, some doctored. Anonymous accounts began pushing a narrative that Jasmine had manipulated evidence, coerced a federal clerk, even accepted money from advocacy groups. It was fiction, but it didn't need to be true. It just needed to sound close enough. Then came the bombshell. A formal complaint filed with the State Bar Association alleging professional misconduct, citing ethical violations during federal proceedings, and demanding a temporary suspension of her license. It was signed by a former DOJ official, a name the public trusted, but one Jasmine and Rebecca knew had direct ties to Alden's former clerks. The complaint was slick, dressed in legal language and manufactured outrage. It cited timestamps, client interactions, courtroom transcripts, every detail carefully cherry-picked, reworded, reassembled into a weapon. And it worked. The media pounced. Networks that had praised her 3 weeks earlier now ran with the headline, "Was Jasmine Crockett the hero or just another player?" News anchors spoke about due process while subtly implying guilt. Blogs posted grainy screenshots implying conflicts of interest. Legal panels debated her future, her past, her motives. Some asked if she'd crossed a line. Others didn't bother with questions. They declared her finished. Inside her office, Jasmine watched it unfold with the same cold stillness she had worn in the courtroom. But behind her eyes, it burned. Not because they doubted her, but because they knew this wasn't about her. It was about sending a message. Don't come this far again. Don't make us bleed again, or we will make you disappear. But what the machine didn't count on was Rebecca. Rebecca Lulton had built her career inside the very system now trying to crush her partner. A former federal prosecutor with scars to prove it, she knew exactly how these things were constructed. Fake timelines, credentialed names, selective outrage, and misdirection. She didn't flinch. She went to work. First, she subpoenaed the IP logs from the complaint's submission portal. Then she ran server forensics on the leaked documents. She cross-referenced the witness testimony cited in the complaint with security badge data from the courthouse. One by one, the holes widened. The complaint had been submitted from a network connected to a lobbying firm once retained by Justice Horizon. The leaked messages originated from an account registered to a burner device, bought in cash 2 weeks prior, 1 block from Alden's former clerk's office. But the final nail came when Rebecca uncovered a digital trail, a set of internal emails, mistakenly sent to a defunct Justice Horizon alias, outlining the plan to reposition the narrative, and undermine public faith in Crockett's legal standing. She didn't wait. She filed a counter motion. She demanded a hearing. The ethics committee convened in a sterile, high-ceiling conference room. No cameras, no press, just legal minds in the war for one woman's name. Jasmine stood silent as Rebecca laid out the case, each piece methodically placed like chess moves. Screens lit up with side-by-side comparisons, file names, IP data, source locations. A clear, orchestrated attempt to assassinate Jasmine's credibility from inside the system. When Rebecca finished, the room didn't clap, but it didn't blink either. The chair of the panel looked down at the fabricated complaint, then up at Jasmine. His words were slow, heavy. This board finds no basis for the charges presented. This case is dismissed. This complaint should never have reached this room. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just exhaled. Once. Slowly. But she wasn't done. She rose from her seat and asked respectfully for the opportunity to say something for the record. They allowed it. And Jasmine stepped to the front of the room, just as she had in the Senate, just as she had in the courtroom. But this time, the target wasn't one man. It was the idea that truth could be punished into silence. Her voice was low, not angry, controlled, resonant. I didn't come here today to clear my name. I came because this is the cost of exposing what we're not supposed to see. I've been called a liar, a radical, a threat to the system. But what does it say about that system when exposing the truth becomes the real crime? What does it say when a judge makes deals in secret and the one who calls it out is the one put on trial? I've been followed, hacked, threatened, and targeted, not because I broke the law, but because I broke the silence. She paused, let the weight of it settle. Justice, she said, eyes locked on the panel, is never free, and sometimes it has to be bought with sacrifice. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. She gathered her things, nodded to Rebecca, and walked out of the hearing room without applause, without cameras, without ceremony. But in the streets outside, in living rooms, in courtrooms, in quiet corners of America, people were listening, people were watching, and now finally people were asking the right question. What kind of system punishes those who try to fix it? And thanks to Jasmine, they were no longer afraid to demand the answer. 12 months had passed since the walls cracked. The country was no longer the same. The facade of an untouchable judiciary had been pierced, and it bled in public. 7 judges were formally removed from the bench in the largest judicial purge in modern U.S. history. 4 more faced federal indictments, their names etched into court filings once reserved for the people they used to rule over. The trials had not yet begun, but the damage was already done. America had seen what lived behind the curtain, and it couldn't unsee it. But while most headlines screamed about scandal and collapse, something quieter had taken root. Reform. The newly formed United States Judicial Reform Commission had been voted into existence by a rare bipartisan effort, its charter forged not from tradition, but necessity. The system needed fixing, and the public demanded someone they could trust to stand near its reconstruction without being consumed by it. There was only one name that made sense: Jasmine Crockett. She refused the title of chair. She didn't want power, but she agreed to serve as honorary legal advisor, overseeing ethical reforms, community outreach, and the early blueprints for a new federal code of transparency. Her involvement was discreet, deliberate. She didn't attend every meeting. She didn't sit for press interviews. She didn't want to become the face of a movement that belonged to millions. She turned down all political offers, Senate, House, even talks of a cabinet seat. She was invited onto talk shows, profiled by magazines, offered book deals. She declined them all, not out of bitterness, not out of pride, but because she understood something most didn't. When the fight is this personal, the stage is the last place you belong. So she left the spotlight, and she built something instead. On the south side of Chicago, inside a renovated red brick post office, she opened the Colonial Law Institute, a legal empowerment center for immigrants, low-income families, and marginalized communities who had never had the tools to fight back. No marble floors, no polished glass, just desks, open doors, and real people. The sign out front didn't carry her name, just a bronze plaque with one line, "Where the law learns to listen." Volunteers came in waves. Law students from across the country asked to clerk there. Former public defenders donated hours. Mothers brought their children just to see what courage looked like in human form. But Jasmine never made speeches. She taught workshops, mentored one-on-one, and reviewed case files late into the night. She had faced down a system and survived, but now she chose to stand beside those still inside it. And then one day something happened that reminded her why she had fought in the first place. It was late afternoon when a boy, maybe 12 years old, pushed open the front door of the institute. He wore a second-hand backpack, scuffed sneakers, and eyes that had already seen more than they should have. Jasmine looked up from a folder as he stepped in, hesitant but determined. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask about programs or paperwork. He just stood in front of her and asked, "Can you teach me how to stand up?" The words hit harder than any ruling, any headline, any gavel strike. She didn't speak right away. She closed the folder gently, leaned forward, and looked him in the eye. Not like an adult addressing a child, but like a fighter recognizing another. Then she said, "You don't need anyone to give you permission to be right. You just need to never apologize for it. Standing up doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins the moment you refuse to sit down when the world tells you to. So yes, I can teach you how to fight. But first, you need to believe that you deserve to." The boy nodded slowly, like someone receiving armor piece by piece. Jasmine smiled. She stood, walked to the shelf behind her, and handed him a small paperback copy of the Constitution. "Start with this," she said, "not because it gives you power, but because it reminds you you've always had it." Outside, the sun dipped behind the roofline of the old building. Inside, the room was quiet. It wasn't the kind of ending that made news. There were no cameras, no applause, no breaking headlines. But for Jasmine Crockett, this was the victory. Not the courtroom, not the hearing, not the headlines, but a single child stepping into a place that had once been denied to voices like his and asking not for permission, but for guidance. Because she had always known, justice doesn't end when the gavel falls. It begins when the next hand reaches for it. Thought for 4 seconds, and in the quiet aftermath of all that storm and fury, a stark realization settled over every shattered corridor and smoke-filled hearing room. Justice is not something gifted from on high, doled out by black-robed arbiters to those they deem worthy. It does not descend in polite decrees or ceremonial gavels, handed down from pedestals like charity to the occasional lucky few. Instead, justice lives in the tremor of a single voice raised in protest, in the steady footfall of someone who refuses to kneel when the world demands it. Jasmine Crockett's life had become a testament to that truth. She had torn through layers of silence and indifference, not by waiting politely for permission, but by unflinchingly stepping into the breach. Every insult hurled at her, every threat to her safety, every attempt to erase her from the record only fanned the flames of her resolve. She learned, sometimes in bruised flesh and sleepless nights, that the law, when left to its own devices, can become a cage instead of a shield. But people with courage carved from necessity, could bend it back toward its promise. In Jasmine's fight, a simple maxim emerged. You don't need permission to do what's right. You just need the will to stand. At first, that lesson was whispered in hallways and small community centers. The single mother whose eviction notice was reversed after Jasmine demanded a hearing. The immigrant families who finally felt seen because she refused to let a deportation flight take off on silence. The teenager who received bail only after Jasmine refused to back down. Each victory was a blow against the idea that courts were impregnable fortresses. But real justice wasn't measured by case-by-case wins alone. It was the ripple effect that followed. Every person who watched Jasmine stand alone felt a tremor beneath their feet, a message coursing through neighborhoods where too many had believed their voices didn't matter. And when those whispers spread into roars, the system trembled. It was never the law itself that saved the day. It was the people wielding it against tyranny, unafraid of the cost. Jasmine became the emblem of that movement, not because she wore a badge, but because she refused to yield. The machinery of power convulsed at the idea that one woman's defiance could fracture centuries of unchallenged authority. They scrubbed transcripts, rewrote emails, whispered in chambers. But the truth, like a river carving through rock, found a way. It poured into courtrooms that once rang with hollow words and reverberated into the streets where children learned that justice doesn't arrive on time unless someone calls it forward. In every battered window, in every midnight vigil, in every quiet prayer offered before dawn, Jasmine's message bloomed. You don't need a permit to protest a wrong. It was as simple as raising a folder of documents and as profound as refusing to leave an empty courtroom. The law cracked open because she demanded that it could. And when it did, people saw what real power looked like. Not the bench, not the gavel, but the will of individuals. Justice does not wear a label, nor does it patrol the halls in search of the oppressed. It waits in the hearts of those who choose not to look away. Jasmine learned that every time she pressed her foot against a courthouse step, every time she met another pair of fearful eyes with unflinching assurance, she was forging justice from thin air. It wasn't a matter of legal precedent. It was spiritual conviction. In the courtroom, she exposed the rot. Outside it, she nurtured the seeds of defiance. She taught that a single affidavit could topple walls, but a movement required thousands of hands. When the judiciary's highest citadels trembled, it wasn't because laws changed. It was because people remembered their own strength. And the boy clutching his tattered constitution at her institute learned that he too could stand tall, unbidden. Transitioning from that institutional battlefield to the battered neighborhoods she served, Jasmine built sanctuaries of empowerment. The Colonial Law Institute, not grand or gilded, but warm with human presence, became ground zero for reclaiming dignity. There, justice learned to speak in plain language, to meet eyes instead of towering over heads. Jasmine refused invitations to power's higher echelons because she knew that platform would distance her from the people who needed her most. She chose classrooms over committees, one-on-one mentoring over televised debates, and in those moments the core truth revealed itself again. Justice thrives when it is shared, not bestowed. The Institute's walls echoed with testimony from the unheard, and Jasmine's simple creed bounced back at every turn. You don't need permission to stand up for what you believe is right. In the swirl of aftermath, when headlines dimmed and political winds shifted, the people Jasmine touched carried her message onward. Across living rooms and lunch counters, her words circulated like gospel. We don't need a royal decree to demand fairness. It was no longer her fight alone. It was theirs. They carried petition forms. They organized community meetings. They confronted bureaucrats armed with unwavering conviction. And the justice system, once thought unshakable, knowed itself vulnerable. Because it was no longer a monolith. It was a living thing, susceptible to the pressure of human will. Courts that once refused hearings now hurried to comply. Judges once unchallenged now paused at the bench. All because bodies and voices had broken the illusion of silence. Yet even as Jasmine's legend grew, she remained painfully aware of the cost. She had scars others couldn't see. Late nights replaying objections in her mind. Mornings waking to the question, did she do enough? Threats still lingered at the edge of her day, and she knew better than most that the system's retaliation could be ruthless. But that knowledge didn't deter her. It fueled her. It reminded her that every sitting official, every silent onlooker, had a moment of choice, to stand or to stand aside. And when they stood, they didn't need a rubber stamp from power. They needed courage. Jasmine became both the spark and the forge, shaping new advocates from raw determination. The final threads of her story were woven not in the glare of media cameras, but in small moments. The single mother who taught her daughter that the law could be wielded for love, not just punishment. The factory worker who walked into a union meeting and didn't look away when injustice was named. The teenager who found his voice in Jasmine's workshops and used it to reclaim his father's custody hearing. Each thread strengthened the fabric of justice, proving that it wasn't a trickle from above, but a tide swelling from human resolve. And in every face lit by newfound hope, Jasmine found proof that her simple message was more than rhetoric. We don't need permission to do what's right. In the end, the most powerful courtroom confrontation was not the one before judges and juries, but the one inside the hearts of ordinary people deciding to act. Jasmine Crockett had wielded her own courage against a system built to resist, and in doing so, she reminded a nation of something essential, that justice is neither a monument nor a mandate. It is a movement. It is not maintained by statutes alone, but by souls who refuse to bow. And if a single woman could stand unflinching in a storm of power and corruption, then any one of us could too. Because the door to justice isn't locked by protocol. It's held open by the steady hand that refuses to be silenced. And in that refusal lies the greatest truth of all. We don't need permission to do what's right. Thought for a couple of seconds. Now it's your turn to step into the breach that Jasmine Crockett opened, because justice won't wait for permission, and neither can we. Stand up today. Call your representatives at dawn's first light and demand that every court be held to the highest standard of transparency and accountability. Share Jasmine's story on every social feed you control, from the smallest group chat to the widest broadcast, until the echo of one woman's courage becomes a chorus of millions. Volunteer your voice and your time at local legal aid clinics, where the system still leaves too many standing alone in the dark. Donate to community centers fighting for fair hearings and unbiased counsel, because every dollar you spare is another lifeline for someone silenced by silence. Organize a city hall vigil or a peaceful rally in front of your local courthouse. Let the sound of your boots on the pavement rattle the foundations of complacency. Write op-eds, letters to the editor, and heartfelt messages that refuse to let this moment slip into oblivion. Mentor a young person, maybe that 12-year-old with big questions, in your neighborhood, teaching them that courage doesn't require invitation. And above all, refuse to sit quietly while injustice is dressed in legalese and paraded as procedure. Demand fairness, speak truth, and claim your right to do what's right. The fight isn't over, not until every courtroom, every judge, and every lawmaker knows that the people will not be silenced, and that we don't need anyone's blessing to demand justice. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. At the airport, Jasmine was falsely accused of stealing a purse, and within minutes, she was unlawfully handcuffed in front of a crowd. That single moment nearly destroyed her career, her reputation, and her freedom. But what happened when they searched her changed everything. What shocking truth did the officers uncover? And why did it leave them frozen in fear? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett moved through Denver International Airport like a storm in silence. The winter chill outside had nothing on her presence. Sharp, composed, unshakable. Dressed in a black tailored vest and boots that echoed like closing arguments, she carried a worn leather case full of courtroom wars. Her eyes scanned the crowd. Calm, calculating, prepared. She wasn't just respected, she was feared in legal circles, known for toppling institutions and silencing corrupt power. But in this terminal, none of that mattered. Here she was just a black woman moving alone. No badge, no spotlight, just bias waiting to pounce. And it was already watching. Suddenly, a sharp scream tore through the terminal, loud enough to slice through the low hum of rolling suitcases and boarding calls. "My purse! My purse is gone!" It wasn't just panic. It was panic wrapped in privilege, shaking the air like a fire alarm. Heads turned immediately. People froze mid-step. Conversations died mid-word. The voice belonged to an older white woman in her 60s, dressed like royalty stepping off a private jet. A full-length mink coat swallowed her frame, diamonds sparkled from her ears, and her lipstick was blood red, too perfect to be smudged even now. She clutched an oversized Hermes handbag, rifling through it with exaggerated desperation, her rings clicking against gold zippers. Her performance was flawless. Manicured hands trembling just enough, voice cracking just right. This wasn't the first time Margot Fairchild had been the center of attention, and it showed. She looked around quickly, wildly. Not to find her purse, but to find someone to blame. Her gaze cut across the terminal, passing over suits, sweatpants, strollers, until it stopped. It locked, and then it struck. Her arms shot forward like a judge slamming a gavel. "Her!" she shrieked, voice rising in triumph and accusation. "That woman right there, she took it." Her finger aimed straight at Jasmine Crockett, standing 10 feet away, calm and unaware until now. "She walked right past me. I felt it. She bumped into me." Margot's voice trembled now with a mix of rage and certainty, the kind of tone that didn't invite doubt. It demanded action. Jasmine blinked. Her body didn't move, but something in the air around her changed. She wasn't confused. She was calculating. She understood exactly what had just happened. The terminal, once filled with random motion and anonymous faces, had suddenly become a courtroom, and she was on trial. Not for what she did, but for who she was. For the color of her skin, for standing near the wrong person at the wrong moment. The space around her seemed to tighten, like a lens narrowing. Conversations restarted, but now they were murmurs, all about her. Phone cameras tilted in her direction. A child asked their father, "What's happening?" And the father whispered something Jasmine couldn't hear, but she already knew what it was. Margot took a step forward, holding her open bag as if it were a smoking gun. "She's trying to walk away with it," she said, though Jasmine hadn't moved an inch. She was right next to me. "You people are good at this, slipping in and out like nothing happened." Jasmine's jaw clenched. Not because of fear, but because of the words "you people." That phrase landed harder than the accusation. It wasn't just about a purse anymore. It was about all the assumptions wrapped around Jasmine's skin, her gender, her presence. Her law degree didn't matter. Her federal court victories didn't matter. Her keynote speech on civil rights delivered 12 hours earlier? Useless now. None of it protected her from being seen exactly the way Margot chose to see her, as a threat in plain sight. The tension in the terminal built fast. Too fast. 1 second, she was just another traveler. The next, she was a suspect under silent indictment by 50 pairs of eyes. No one asked for proof. No one asked Jasmine what happened. Not even a glance toward her luggage, her hands, her path. The accusation was enough. It had already shaped the story in people's minds. Wealthy white woman victimized by a suspicious, well-dressed, but sneaky black woman. Jasmine felt it all in her chest. The pressure, the rage, the ache of a truth she knew too well. If she spoke too firmly, she'd be aggressive. If she stayed silent, she'd be evasive. Every move from this moment forward would be judged through a broken lens. Jasmine looked at Margot and finally spoke, her voice low, steady, and deadly precise. "I didn't take your purse," she said. "Check your things again before you make accusations you can't take back." But the damage had been done. All around her, people had already picked sides, and most weren't standing on hers. A businessman in a gray blazer leaned toward his wife and muttered, "She's too calm. That's suspicious." A young security officer across the terminal reached for his walkie, and Margot, emboldened by the growing audience, raised her voice again. "She's playing innocent. Don't let her leave," she shouted. Her face was red now, flaring with the righteous fury of someone who believed the world owed her instant validation, and it would get worse before it got better. Jasmine knew that. This wasn't the first time her dignity had been put on trial by strangers, but something in her spine stiffened. The same steel that had won her courtroom battles and scared men twice her size into silence. Her silence now wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Her expression didn't change, but inside she was already gathering every detail, every timestamp, every angle of every camera in this terminal. Because this time, she would be the one pressing charges. But Jasmine didn't even have time to respond to the crowd before the atmosphere shifted again. This time, heavier. The kind of heavy that comes with authority, with power walking in like it owns the air. The sound of boots hitting polished tile cut through the tension like a judge's gavel slamming down. 3 officers emerged from the far end of the terminal, moving fast, eyes locked on the scene ahead. The crowd made way instinctively, Not out of respect, but out of fear. Because when uniforms moved like that, something was about to happen. Lieutenant Donald Huxley led the pack, his chest out, jaw tight, an expression carved from stone. He looked like a man who'd stopped listening years ago and started deciding instead. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask, didn't pause to read the room, because to him the room had already spoken. He walked like he already had the truth in his back pocket, and what he saw didn't surprise him. A sobbing white woman, a silent black one, and an open stage to exercise his authority. Behind him came Officer Tom Keller, younger, less certain, but trying to keep pace. He glanced at Huxley every few steps like a trainee following a senior into a war zone. His jaw was tight, eyes darting between Margot and Jasmine, unsure of how to read what he was seeing, but willing to follow orders if it meant staying out of trouble. The last in the formation was Officer Emma Ruiz, older than Keller, steadier in her movements, but not in her certainty. Her eyes flicked from the scene to the crowd, to Jasmine, to the phones now recording from the corners of the terminal. She wasn't blind. Something about this didn't feel right, but she said nothing. Not yet. Huxley's presence was too strong, and her silence had been trained into her like muscle memory. Huxley didn't ask a single question. Not to the woman yelling, not to the woman standing silently. He barely acknowledged Margot's flailing hands and tear-filled eyes before locking his gaze on Jasmine, his eyes cold and clinical. There was no curiosity, no attempt at due process. He wasn't trying to find out what happened. He was trying to prove what he already believed. And what he believed was simple. A black woman had been accused. She was alone. She was calm. Too calm. And that made her dangerous. That was all the evidence he needed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice like ice cracking under pressure. "Drop your bag. Step back. Show me your hands." The words came fast and flat, without emotion, like he was reading them from a checklist. His tone wasn't demanding justice. It was demanding compliance. Jasmine didn't move. Her heart pounded, but her body remained still. Her eyes locked on Huxley with professional precision, like she was already taking mental depositions. "Are you going to ask me what happened?" she asked, her voice firm but measured. "Or is this how you handle all accusations? No questions? Just action?" Huxley didn't answer. He didn't even blink. He waved one hand in the air like swatting a fly and looked to his subordinates. "She's the one," he said. "Search her, then cuff her." That was it. No pause, no explanation. Just a command dropped like a hammer. Jasmine felt her heart slam against her chest, not because she feared the cuffs, but because she had seen this exact moment play out in too many lives, too many headlines. She had fought this in courtrooms. She had lectured about this at universities, and now she was living it, in real time, in public, with strangers watching, filming, whispering. No Miranda rights, no investigation. Just a decision made the moment Huxley laid eyes on her. Ruiz hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Jasmine noticed. Ruiz's hand hovered near her belt, not in preparation, in uncertainty. Her posture shifted, slightly backward, as if she wanted to step out of the frame. She looked at Huxley, then at Jasmine, then at the crowd again. There were phones up now. There were witnesses. There was doubt. But she didn't act on it. She didn't stop it. Because hesitation without courage is silence, and silence protects power. Keller was already pulling out the handcuffs. His fingers fumbled slightly on the hinge, betraying nerves. He was young but not blind. Still, he moved. Because orders were orders, and hesitation wasn't a luxury he thought he could afford. Jasmine raised her voice slightly, projecting not for Huxley, but for the cameras. "This is unlawful," she said, her voice sharp and deliberate. "No questions, no ID check, no surveillance review, just cuffs." The words rang out like a charge sheet, not just against the officers, but against the entire system. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was narrating a failure in progress for every camera in that terminal to record and remember. But Huxley had already tuned her out. "You think I care about your lectures?" he snapped, stepping forward until he was uncomfortably close. His breath hit her cheek. His tone was sharper now, baiting her. "What are you, a lawyer? A politician? Doesn't matter. You match the description. End of story." Jasmine narrowed her eyes. Her voice dropped low, almost a whisper. "What description exactly?" she said. "Black, female, standing too close to a white woman's purse?" But Huxley wasn't listening. He wasn't here to debate. He was here to dominate. He raised his voice just enough to draw a new hush across the crowd. "Final warning," he said. "Comply or we escalate. No specifics, no justification, just pure control, cold, mechanical, and practiced." Jasmine turned her head slightly and locked eyes with Ruiz. One last time, a final call for conscience. "This is your moment." But Ruiz looked down, and Jasmine knew. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed. The cuffs were cold, biting into her wrists, but Jasmine didn't flinch. Her voice, clear and deliberate, cut through the murmuring crowd like a scalpel. "I am a U.S. citizen. I have rights. You are violating them." Her words weren't a protest. They were a declaration, carved from years of courtroom battles and civil rights lectures. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't beg. She asserted, with the tone of someone who had memorized the Constitution not as theory, but as weapon. "You had no warrant, no probable cause, no evidence, and no reason to put your hands on me," she said, her eyes locked on Huxley with unwavering force. The silence that followed wasn't respect. It was tension thickening into threat. But Huxley didn't respond with law. He responded with rank. "You're cuffed," he said flatly. "That's all that matters." He stared at her not like a suspect, but like a challenge. Like he hated that she wasn't shaking, that she dared to look him in the eye with her back straight and her voice sharp. "This isn't a debate," he added, leaning in. "You're not in court now, sweetheart." Jasmine's jaw tightened. Not because of the insult. She'd heard worse. But because of the way the badge on his chest seemed to grant him permission to ignore everything she'd said, everything she was. "No, I'm not in court," she replied, "which is exactly why this is happening. You'd never speak to me like this in front of a judge." Ruiz blinked. Keller shifted, but no one stepped in. Jasmine took a deep breath. Her wrists ached, but her voice stayed steady. "You didn't ask for my ID," she said. "You didn't ask what happened. You didn't verify a single word of that woman's story." Her eyes swept across the faces watching, then back to the officers. "You saw a black woman standing near a white accuser, and that was all you needed." Her voice didn't tremble. It pierced. Every word calculated, crisp, undeniable. "That's not justice. That's profiling. That's abuse of power." A few people in the crowd murmured. A man holding his phone muttered, "She's right." Another whispered, "Why won't they check the cameras?" Ruiz hesitated again, her hands hovering near Jasmine's blazer. There was a flicker of discomfort in her eyes. Not defiance, but recognition. Jasmine saw it, seized it. "You don't have to follow an illegal order," she said calmly. "You can say no." Ruiz's lips parted, but no words came. She looked at Huxley, who didn't even look back. "Do your job," he barked. "We're not standing here all day while she gives us a TED Talk." Jasmine exhaled slowly. "You're not doing your job," she said, voice firm but even. "You're violating federal law, and you're doing it on camera." She nodded toward the nearest phone. "So I hope you're ready to explain it later. Under oath." Ruiz finally moved forward. Her fingers were hesitant, brushing the fabric of Jasmine's blazer, then pausing again. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't resist. Ruiz's hands were methodical, cautious, almost reluctant as they moved across Jasmine's torso. Not rough, not invasive, but not gentle either. This wasn't protocol. This was damage control disguised as procedure. Jasmine stood still, her chin slightly lifted, her jaw tight, eyes forward. She didn't resist, but she didn't shrink either. She didn't offer comfort. She offered truth. Ruiz reached the inside of Jasmine's blazer and felt something hard. Not round like a phone or square like a wallet. It was slim, solid, tightly tucked into the inner pocket with deliberate precision. She hesitated. Then slowly, like peeling open a box she already knew contained something dangerous, Ruiz reached in and pulled it free. A black leather credential holder, sleek, professional, worn just enough to prove it wasn't decorative. Ruiz opened the flap and froze. Inside was a federal identification badge, gleaming beneath the terminal's artificial lights. The gold seal of the United States Department of Justice was stamped in the center, bold and unmistakable. Next to it, encased behind clear plastic, was a government-issued ID card, complete with Jasmine's photo, full name, and multiple lines of authority. Jasmine Crockett, Eskers Bar Certified, Federal Circuit Licensed Attorney, National Level Advisor, Judicial Oversight Council. Ruiz's breath caught. Her eyes widened, flicking between the badge and Jasmine. Her hands lowered as if the item had suddenly become too heavy to hold. The color drained from her face. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but in the quiet way guilt creeps in when truth hits harder than force ever could. She turned toward Huxley, holding out the wallet like evidence from a crime scene. "Lieutenant," she said softly, "you need to see this." At first, Huxley didn't move. He was still watching Jasmine like she was a ticking bomb. But now the wires were visible, and he knew he'd cut the wrong ones. He took the wallet from Ruiz's hand without a word. His eyes dropped to the contents. 1 second, 2, and just like that, his jaw slackened. Gone was the iron authority, the loud certainty. It collapsed under the weight of those few laminated words. His lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. The silence was brutal. It wasn't the silence of someone thinking. It was the silence of a man who knew he was absolutely, irreversibly wrong. Keller leaned in, curious, his youthful confusion quickly turning to horror as he saw the badge. He stepped back like he'd touched something electric, his face pale, his body stiff. "She's an attorney?" he mumbled, almost to himself. "A federal one?" Ruiz nodded once, still visibly shaken. "High clearance, judiciary level." Her voice was quiet but carried weight now. The weight of shame, of realization, of watching the truth land like a hammer on their credibility. Jasmine still hadn't moved. She didn't need to. Her hands were still cuffed, but her presence was towering. The power they tried to strip from her now radiated through every fiber of her stillness. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but devastating. "Do you want to keep going?" she asked. "Maybe you'll find my law school transcripts next, or the ethics award I got from the National Bar Association." Huxley said nothing. He was holding the wallet like it might explode. He looked up slowly, his face drained of arrogance, replaced now with something harder to fake. Fear. Real fear. Not of Jasmine, but of what she represented, of what this moment could become. The videos, the lawsuits, the hearings, the headlines. Ruiz shifted uncomfortably beside him, and Keller looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The power dynamic had flipped in an instant. Jasmine didn't yell. She didn't gloat. But the air around her crackled like electricity. The cameras were still rolling. The bystanders were still watching. And now they were watching them, the cops, squirm. Everything Huxley had tried to command, control, and crush was now staring him in the face. Laminated, official, and utterly unforgiving. The silence that followed Ruiz's trembling reveal of the badge was deafening. But Jasmine let it stretch. Let them sit in it. Let the discomfort settle on their skin like sweat under body armor. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't gloat. She simply let the truth breathe. Something they hadn't given her the chance to do. Her wrists were still locked in metal, her blazer slightly askew from the search, but her composure was bulletproof. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the three officers. Huxley, still holding the wallet with stiff fingers. Keller shrinking into himself like a child who'd broken something valuable. And Ruiz, standing rigid, ashamed, her eyes on the floor. Jasmine's expression didn't change, but the corners of her mouth lifted. Not into a grin, but a controlled, knowing curve. The kind of smile you give right before delivering a closing argument that ends careers. "Well," she said quietly, but loud enough for everyone around them to hear, "do any of you want to talk about rights now?" The words landed like a knife turned slowly in a wound. No one answered. "You ignored my voice," she continued, her tone razor-sharp but calm. "You ignored the Constitution. You chose instinct over facts, fear over procedure, and skin color over sense." Her hands shifted slightly in the cuffs, but she didn't ask to be released. Not yet. You didn't just disrespect me, she added. You disrespected the oath you swore when you pinned on that badge. Keller looked like he might cry. Ruiz looked like she wanted to disappear. Huxley's face was locked in a neutral mask, but his hands told the truth. Fingers clenched tighter around the badge. Knuckles pale. Jasmine raised one brow, then said evenly, "Let's make a call, shall we?" Slowly, deliberately, she brought her cuffed hands forward and reached into her blazer pocket, making sure every movement was controlled, visible, non-threatening. The crowd watched in total silence, phones still raised, some jaws hanging open. Jasmine fished out her phone and tapped in her passcode with muscle memory. 4 digits, 1 revolution. Her contact list opened, and she scrolled with her thumb until she found the name. Judge Annalise Whitmore. No hesitation, no second guessing, just one tap. Then she lifted the phone to her ear, her eyes never leaving Huxley. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked. "Judge Whitmore, it's Jasmine Crockett," she said, voice now clear and commanding. She spoke like she was back in federal court, floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, the seal of the United States hanging over her shoulder. "I'm calling from Denver International. I've been unlawfully detained and publicly humiliated by 3 uniformed officers who never asked for ID, never verified a claim, and never checked a single camera." She paused, letting that land. "I informed them I was a federal attorney. They ignored it. They've just discovered my credentials during an illegal search." Her tone didn't rise, but every word was a strike. Clean, deliberate, lethal. She paused again, listening. Then, "Yes. This is on video. Yes, there are dozens of witnesses." Huxley's face twitched, the first crack in his armor. Keller was now visibly shaking, and Ruiz had taken a half step back. Jasmine nodded once into the phone. "Understood. I'll remain here. I expect someone from the DOJ to contact airport security directly." Another pause. "Thank you, Your Honor." And she hung up. The motion was slow, final, like lowering a gavel. She slid the phone back into her jacket with precision, then looked directly at Huxley. Her voice was calm, dangerously calm. "You didn't want to hear me then, but you'll hear from them now." The cameras were still rolling. The crowd wasn't just filming a woman being wronged anymore. They were filming a system being held accountable in real time. "I hope you took good notes," she added softly, "because I promise you, this won't be the last time you're asked to explain what you did today." And for the first time since they'd arrived, none of the officers could bring themselves to speak. And then it happened. 30 minutes after the call, the tension snapped. The sliding doors at the far end of the terminal opened with a mechanical hiss, but the presence that entered felt anything but mechanical. Leading the group was a woman in a sleek navy suit, her DOJ badge gleaming at her waist, a federal enforcement patch stitched on her shoulder. She moved like someone who didn't speak unless she was about to change someone's future. On her left was a plainclothes officer, taller, older, face hard as carved granite, from the Office of Inspector General, Internal Affairs Division. On her right, a sharply dressed representative from Airport Administration, flanked by 2 airport security supervisors. No one announced them. They didn't need to. The entire crowd instinctively parted as they approached. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She just waited. Calm, composed, knowing this was what accountability looked like when it arrived wearing a suit instead of a badge. The federal agent stopped in front of Huxley. Her voice was clear, clipped, and professional. "Lieutenant Donald Huxley, Officer Thomas Keller, Officer Emma Ruiz. Effective immediately, you are relieved of all field duties." Her eyes didn't blink. "You are under active review for violations of federal civil rights protections, improper detainment, and abuse of authority. You are instructed to place your firearms, badges, radios, and any other department-issued equipment on the floor. Now." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Huxley's face twitched. The mask of authority he had worn so easily earlier was now cracking around the edges. He glanced toward Jasmine, and that, more than anything, said it all. She didn't flinch. She didn't return the look. She simply stared forward, as if daring him to say a single word. Keller moved first, hesitant. His hands shook as he unclipped his belt and carefully placed his holstered firearm and radio on the tile. He removed his badge last, staring at it like he couldn't believe it was leaving his hands. Ruiz followed slower, eyes glassy, mouth tight. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She knew. She unbuckled her duty belt, laid it down with a quiet clink, and stepped back like she wanted to fade into the floor. But Huxley, he waited, for a second too long, as if hoping this was all a bluff. As if waiting for someone to walk in and tell him this wasn't happening. But it was, and it wasn't going away. The federal agent took one step closer. "Lieutenant," she said again, this time lower, firmer. "This is not optional." Huxley's jaw locked. His fingers moved stiffly, mechanically, as he removed his weapon. Then his radio. Then finally his badge. The symbol he had used to crush someone's dignity without hesitation. He placed it down with deliberate force, like he could somehow reclaim control through the sound of metal on tile. But no sound could fix what had been broken. And now all eyes weren't on Jasmine anymore. They were on him, on what he'd done, on what it meant. The plainclothes officer stepped forward, collecting the surrendered gear into a large black evidence bag. No words, just procedure. Clean, cold, official. The airport representative then turned toward Jasmine, eyes flicking to the cuffs on her wrist with barely concealed horror. "Please remove those restraints immediately," he said, directing the command not to his staff, but to the officers who had applied them. No one moved, until Ruiz quietly stepped forward. Hands trembling, she pulled the key from her belt and unlocked the cuffs. First one wrist, then the other. The metal fell away with two soft clicks that somehow echoed louder than anything else. Jasmine didn't rub her wrists. She didn't thank them. She simply brought her hands to the front, fixed the sleeve of her blazer, and stood tall. She turned slightly toward the crowd, not for applause, not for validation, but so every phone filming could capture what accountability looks like when it finally shows up late, but dressed right. Then she looked directly at the federal agent. "Are we ready to file the formal report?" she asked, voice calm but unmistakably sharp. The agent nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. And this time, we'll start by asking you what happened." And with that, the balance of power was finally corrected. Not through apology, not through begging, but through truth, patience, and the unshakable strength of someone who refused to shrink, even when the system tried to make her disappear. As the final badge hit the floor and the weight of consequence settled over the room, another ripple broke through the crowd. Quieter, but just as damning. A young airport security officer came jogging toward the cluster of officials, clutching something beige and bulky in his gloved hands. He looked pale, almost confused, like someone who just uncovered evidence from a crime that wasn't supposed to exist. He stopped short of the federal agent, glanced at Jasmine, then looked directly at the woman who had started it all. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Margot Fairchild, who now stood off to the side, still trying to hold on to the last shreds of her false indignation. "We found your purse." The words hit the terminal like a thunderclap. "It was lodged inside the lining of your coat, wedged between the silk and the inner seam. Nothing appears to be missing." Margot blinked. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. Her hands twitched as the officer held out the bag. For a second, she didn't take it. Couldn't. Her fingers hovered just above the straps, like touching it would make the truth too real. Slowly, almost grudgingly, she accepted it, eyes never meeting Jasmine's. She opened the purse, looked inside. Credit cards, wallet, makeup, cash, all there. The air in the terminal changed again. This time it wasn't tension. It was realization. Raw, collective realization. Whispers turned into murmurs. Faces turned toward Margot with something colder than judgment. Disgust. She had pointed. She had lied. She had nearly destroyed someone's life over a moment of carelessness and a lifetime of entitlement. And through it all, Jasmine stood still. She didn't yell. She didn't gloat. She didn't say what everyone was thinking. She simply looked at the purse, then looked back at the room, and said with devastating calm, "If I didn't have that badge, would any of you have believed me?" Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The words settled into the air like smoke from a gun still warm. No one answered. They couldn't, because every person in that terminal already knew the truth. The echo of Jasmine's question, "Would any of you have believed me without that badge?" still hung in the air like smoke after a shot. No one had answered. No one could. Because that wasn't a question. That was a statement of truth too sharp to be softened, too raw to be argued. And in that silence, decisions began forming behind closed doors. Over the next few days, headlines erupted. Videos went viral. Federal response teams issued public statements. News anchors debated whether justice had truly been served. Editorials called it everything from a tragic misunderstanding to an exposed nerve in American law enforcement. And while the nation argued over the viral footage of a black woman in cuffs who turned out to be a federal attorney, Jasmine Crockett sat in quiet rooms with legal boards, agency directors, and judicial committees, not just as a victim, but as a force of accountability. Everyone had expected the firings to be swift, brutal, permanent. They weren't. Lieutenant Huxley, Officer Keller, and Officer Ruiz were not terminated immediately. There were internal discussions, union politics, legal reviews, technicalities were examined, precedents dissected. And in the end, the final ruling was announced not with drama, but in a sterile press briefing that left more questions than answers. All three officers would be placed under a 12-month intensive retraining and review program developed jointly by the Department of Justice, the Office of Civil Rights, and the Federal Judicial Review Board. To the public, it sounded like leniency. To Jasmine, it sounded like delay. But what came next would still test them in ways they never imagined. The program wasn't cosmetic, it wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't optional. From day one, the three officers were stripped of their weapons, their patrol responsibilities, and any authority over civilians. Instead, they were seated in windowless rooms for federal-level training on civil liberties, police accountability, implicit bias, and constitutional rights. Every morning began with a written quiz. Every afternoon involved hours of classroom instruction led by civil rights attorneys, sociologists, and community advocates, many of whom looked like Jasmine. Huxley hated it. His silence was thick with resentment. He never spoke unless called on, and even then his answers came clipped, defensive, like the law itself had betrayed him. Keller struggled. He took notes feverishly, asked questions clumsily, and flinched when instructors played footage from the airport. Footage of him cuffing a federal attorney while nodding along to unlawful commands. Ruiz listened, quiet, focused. But her silence was different now. Not hesitation, but reckoning. On the third week, the officers were required to attend a panel titled, "When the System Fails You, Voices from the Margins." Jasmine wasn't on the panel, but her name came up, again and again, not just as a headline, but as a warning, as an example of what happens when procedure is replaced by prejudice. And then came the assignments. They weren't lectures, they were essays. Describe a time when you exercised power without verifying facts. How does implicit bias influence threat perception? If Jasmine Crockett had not revealed her credentials, what would the arrest report have said? The instructors didn't want apologies. They wanted introspection, blood-deep, bone-deep honesty. Most officers in similar programs treated it like a checklist. This one didn't let them. By month 4, the program got harder. Now came the simulation chambers, realistic scenarios built to expose how officers react under stress, confusion, and uncertainty. Actors played civilians of every race, age, background. The scenarios were designed not for speed, but for choice. In one room, Keller faced a black teenager yelling at an officer for harassing his brother. The actor reached into his hoodie. Keller hesitated, longer than he would have 6 months ago, but still drew his baton. The instructor paused the scene. "Let's rewind," she said. "Now imagine that kid is your nephew. Try again." In another exercise, Ruiz was forced to mediate a shouting match between a Latina mother and a white man threatening to call ICE. She paused. Tried empathy. She passed that one. Huxley failed 3 scenarios in a row, not because he made the wrong call, because he refused to make a new one. He stuck to instinct, protocol, authority. The instructors didn't care. "You followed the rule," one told him. "The rules are why you're here." Month 6 brought community immersion. Once a week, the 3 officers were required to meet with local leaders, clergy members, and racial justice advocates. Off-duty, no uniform, no badge. One night, they sat in a rec center across from ex-offenders who had been racially profiled. Another night, they heard from public defenders, mostly black and brown women, who spent their careers undoing the kind of damage Huxley and Keller had caused in a single shift. Each meeting ended with a journal entry, signed and reviewed. If it sounded performative, it wasn't, because every entry had to be submitted to the Civilian Oversight Board, where Jasmine Crockett now served as an appointed legal advisor. She didn't see the officers, but she saw their words. She read Keller's entry from week 9. I didn't realize how many times I've assumed guilt before asking a question. I see myself in every mistake I was trained not to make. She read Ruiz's entry from week 12. I thought silence made me neutral. Now I see silence made me complicit. And she read Huxley's from week 14. Short, bitter, resentful. No amount of training will undo what this country needs to fix in its people. That was the first week his score dropped below passing. By month 9, consequences got real. Each officer was assigned a case review, a real incident involving misconduct by another officer. They had to present it to a panel, explain what went wrong, and what should have been done instead. Keller picked a 2019 airport case involving a false accusation, eerily similar to Jasmine's. His voice cracked halfway through. He still got through it. Ruiz chose a body cam review of a domestic dispute mishandled by an impatient officer. She ended her presentation with a line the panel wouldn't forget. Being the quiet one doesn't make you the better cop. It just makes you the quieter danger. Huxley refused to complete his. He said it was political. He said it was a waste of time. The panel failed him for the quarter. By month 12, the review board convened. 3 files sat on a long table inside a federal building. One belonged to Keller, one to Ruiz, one to Huxley. Each file contained their performance scores, video logs, essays, journals, and peer evaluations. Each officer had to sit before a committee composed of legal experts, civil rights leaders, and 2 federal judges, and answer one final question. Why should you be trusted to wear a badge again? Keller spoke with humility. His voice was unsure but honest. He didn't ask for a second chance. He asked for a first one he hadn't realized he'd never earned. Ruiz was quiet but clear. She didn't ask to be reinstated. She said, if I do come back, I'll speak when others won't. And if I don't, I'll still fight for what's right. Just not in a uniform. Huxley stared at the table. When asked the question, he answered, because I followed protocol. That was all he said, and it was all they needed to hear. Jasmine received the decision 3 days later in her inbox. Keller, conditional reinstatement with mandatory mentorship and quarterly reviews. Ruiz, approved for re-entry with limitations on supervisory roles. Huxley, terminated, permanently ineligible for law enforcement work nationwide. She read the report, closed the file, and finally, after a year of holding her breath, she exhaled. Because justice for once didn't arrive all at once. But this time, it didn't walk away either. The decision spread like wildfire. By noon, the official ruling had made national news. 3 officers, 1 permanently banned, 2 sent back for review and retraining. Jasmine's name trended for the 4th time in a month, this time not as the victim, but as the woman who'd held the mirror up to an entire institution. But with the exposure came the storm. Across newsrooms, classrooms, churches, and street corners, one question lit up conversations like a fuse. Was this justice? The city's reaction fractured instantly. Half saw reform, half saw retreat. The Justice Department released a statement defending the 12-month program as a rigorous, precedent-setting disciplinary structure rooted in education, accountability, and long-term change. It detailed the coursework, the mandatory psychological evaluations, the community engagement requirements. Officials cited Keller and Ruiz's compliance, their journals, their progress. We are not in the business of punishment for show, the statement read. We are in the business of transformation. For some, that landed. For others, it sounded like a carefully worded excuse. Civil rights groups were divided. Some veteran advocates took a measured stance. This is the first time we've seen law enforcement placed under long-term civilian educational review. one organizer said on live television. If this model works, it could change the system from the inside out. Others were less forgiving. If this is what justice looks like for a high-profile attorney with federal credentials and video proof, what chance does a working-class black man have with none of that? Said one young activist into a wall of microphones outside the city courthouse. The tension rippled through every demographic, every age group. Those who'd fought too long to believe in change couldn't celebrate something that still felt like survival. And those desperate for progress were clinging to any sign of forward motion, even if it was slow, incomplete, and uncomfortable. On community radio stations, callers lined up to voice their thoughts. An elderly black man broke down in tears on air. When I saw those cuffs on her, it was like watching my granddaughter get arrested for breathing, he said. I don't care about training. I care about accountability. A white retired police captain called in from the suburbs, voice sharp with frustration. They didn't fire them because they know that firing wouldn't fix the culture. You want real change? Then you've got to rewire people, not just replace them. The host let the line go quiet for a moment, letting listeners sit with the contradiction. Both men were right, and both were exhausted. Protests reignited downtown, not massive, but relentless. Day after day, people gathered outside the police union headquarters with signs that didn't mince words. Education isn't consequence. If she didn't have a badge, she'd have a record. No justice, no quiet. And then there were the counter voices, letters to editors, talk show hosts, comment sections full of fury. Some accused Jasmine of grandstanding. Others claimed the officers had been ruined for doing their jobs. What's the point of policing if you're going to get punished for acting fast? One angry caller asked on conservative radio. The host replied, acting fast is different than acting right, and they didn't. But that didn't stop the narrative from spinning out. That Jasmine had overreached, that the punishment was political, that the training program was just a backdoor firing without due process. Jasmine watched the chaos unfold not from a podium, but from behind her office door. She read the coverage. She saw the hashtags. She heard the praise, and the resentment, and the fatigue. And through it all, she said very little. The cameras were still chasing her, but she didn't run toward them. She wasn't interested in being a symbol. Symbols are clean. Jasmine was not. She was still bruised, still tired, still walking into courtrooms where she could see the same assumptions in the eyes of strangers. The kind that don't vanish just because a name trends for a week. She attended a closed-door meeting with the DOJ Advisory Council 2 weeks after the ruling. They asked her how she felt about the disciplinary outcomes. She paused, not for effect, but for honesty. It's a beginning, she said, but beginnings don't feel like victories when you had to bleed to get them. One member nodded. Another wrote it down. No one pushed back. Outside, the city continued to argue with itself. Some called her story inspiring. Others called it a warning. A few still refused to see the problem. But no one, not one person, could pretend it didn't happen. Because now the video existed. Because now her name was written into the city's memory. Because now the phrase, "you match the description," had met its match. The office was still. No cameras, no microphones, no crowds or questions. Just Jasmine, just the report. And a silence so deep it almost pulsed. The final page of the DOJ investigation rested beneath her fingertips. Her eyes didn't move, but her mind was racing, not with triumph, not with relief, but with something heavier, a slow, sinking truth that even a formal declaration of innocence, even the suspension of officers, even national headlines hadn't managed to erase the most bitter part of it all. If she hadn't had that badge, she wouldn't be sitting here right now. She'd be forgotten, or fighting for her name, or worse. She leaned back slowly in her chair, the leather groaning under her as if echoing her exhaustion. The city glittered outside her window, oblivious. The same city that had watched her get handcuffed like a common criminal, then shifted uncomfortably when the truth came out. They called it a victory, a rare win for justice. But she knew better. Because justice that only comes when you wear a title, when your ID opens doors, when you look like you belong, that's not justice. That's a loophole. And Jasmine Crockett had spent her whole life closing those. Her eyes wandered to the bookshelf across the room. Framed degrees, law books, a glass award engraved with her name from the National Bar Association. They were meant to symbolize protection, credibility, but that day, none of them had mattered until the moment a badge flashed. Her mind drifted unwillingly back to that airport, back to the cuffs, back to the way the officers' eyes changed when they saw her credentials, from power to panic, from righteous to ruined. She remembered the pause, the silence, the terror in their expressions when they realized they had picked the wrong one. Not because they'd made a mistake, but because their mistake had consequences. Because the woman they tried to break had tools to fight back. But what if she hadn't? That question dug its claws deeper the longer she sat with it. She stood, walked across the office, opened a cabinet drawer she hadn't touched in weeks. Inside were thick files, civil suits, depositions, transcripts from years of court cases. Most had settled, some had disappeared. All had one thing in common. They were people who looked like her, but unlike her, they didn't have law degrees, federal IDs, or access to media. They were names the world wouldn't remember, faces that never went viral. She pulled out a folder marked Mitchell versus City of Chicago, excessive force. Inside was a photo, a teenage boy with a split lip and a stare far too old for his age. He never got a formal apology, no statement, no training program. He got a bruised jaw, a misunderstanding, and a sealed settlement agreement. Another file, Reyes v. State Troopers. A mother stopped on her way to a food bank, accused of theft, detained with her daughter. No charges, just fear, just silence. Jasmine closed her eyes. She could still hear the echoes of their voices, still feel the injustice humming under her skin. And she knew her story had gone public because it made good headlines. But the real crisis, the real story was still happening, every day, unseen, undocumented, unchallenged. She pressed a hand to her chest and inhaled, slowly, then opened her laptop. This wasn't about her anymore. It never had been. She spent the next 72 hours writing, planning, sketching, not for a lawsuit, not for a book deal, for something bigger, a new kind of program, one that didn't rely on policy binders or performative lectures, one that didn't let anyone sit in a chair and nod their way through an hour-long slideshow before signing off as reformed. This would be different. It had to be. She outlined the pillars carefully. 1. Real stories, not simulations, body cam footage, victim interviews, closed case evidence reviewed publicly. 2. Accountability exercises. Every officer required to analyze their own past decisions, challenge their assumptions, and reflect. In writing, on camera, in front of peers. 3. Civilian-led discussions. No chain of command, no uniforms, just people sitting across from one another, face-to-face, stripped of rank. 4. Emotional impact training. Not facts, but feeling. Not just the law, but what it feels like when the law fails you. 5. No exemptions. Rookies, veterans, supervisors. Everyone goes through it. Everyone answers. She titled it, Law and Perception, Breaking the Cycle Before It Begins, and in smaller font beneath, created and led by Jasmine Crockett, S.K. By the time she made the first call to pitch the concept, her voice was steady, cold even. She wasn't asking anyone for permission. She was informing them of what came next. She booked a pilot series with a police department in New Jersey, then another in Atlanta, then one in Texas. Some chiefs welcomed it. Some pushed back. She didn't care. She wasn't in the business of comfort. She was in the business of interruption. Each session opened with the same line. You've all learned how to control a suspect. I'm here to teach you how not to create one. No one clapped. No one joked. And that's exactly how she wanted it. Because by the end of each day, every officer had looked at the screen and seen themselves. Reflected not as heroes, not as villains, but as humans with power they didn't always understand. Jasmine made them watch her footage, frame by frame, pause, rewind, break it down. Then she asked the question that still echoed in her bones. If I didn't have that badge, What would you have done to me? By month 3, departments began requesting access. By month 6, the DOJ sent observers. By month 9, Jasmine had hired a full-time staff. And yet, every night, after the lights were off and the cities had quieted, she came back to the same thought, the same fire. That justice didn't happen in courtrooms. It happened when someone chose to see a person before a profile. It happened when the law stopped reacting and started listening. It happened when the system didn't need to be sued to admit it was wrong. And until that became the standard, not the exception, Jasmine would keep teaching. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Because somewhere out there, someone was being judged by the way they walked, the way they dressed, the way they looked, and they wouldn't have a badge to save them. But maybe, just maybe, they'd meet an officer who had sat in Jasmine's classroom, and that might be enough to change everything. The greatest takeaway from Jasmine Crockett's ordeal isn't just the revelation that law enforcement can err. It's the brutal reminder of how quickly injustice can strike when bias replaces proof. She stood in that airport, an accomplished attorney, yet still felt the sting of dehumanization the moment someone pointed a finger and screamed, "Thief!" Her story forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that labels, even prestigious ones, only matter if the system feels pressured to recognize them. Without that badge in her coat pocket, her defense might have been drowned out by prejudice and panic. This high-stakes narrative peels back the layers of society's reliance on split-second judgments, challenging us to ask how many voices are silenced simply because they lack the right credentials. It reminds us that justice isn't a static idea, but a precarious balance that can tip based on who stands before it. Jasmine's resilience in the face of false accusation underscores a larger issue, that everyday citizens, stripped of power or status, risk being swallowed whole by systemic biases. By refusing to crumble when humiliated, she revealed not only the cruelty of assumption, but also the power of one unshakable truth. And that truth is this: if a person with her influence can nearly be devoured by a flawed system, imagine how many are consumed daily with no recourse at all. From the moment Jasmine was forced into handcuffs, we saw the stark reality of how easily suspicion can override basic rights. That visceral image of a well-dressed woman, deserving of dignity, being treated like a dangerous criminal, cracks open the question: what if she had been someone with no legal background, no federal connections, no media spotlight? The tension soared when everyone assumed guilt before evidence, demonstrating how fragile innocence becomes when prejudice is allowed to roam unchecked. Yet the most haunting aspect of her story is that she won not by simply proving her truth, but by wielding a badge that spoke louder than her skin color. This is a moral lesson etched in pain, showing us that credentials can function as a flimsy barrier, protecting some and leaving others to face the storm alone. By highlighting the ease with which false accusations can take root, Jasmine's predicament confronts us with a moral imperative: to demand a world in which justice doesn't hinge on rank, title, or any external advantage. Her calm defiance in the face of that humiliating arrest became the foundation for a larger conversation about how we define credibility and whose voices we invalidate without a second thought. In that sense, her story doesn't end with a personal victory. It evolves into a resonant message about reimagining accountability. Because if her voice only mattered once her ID appeared, then the question remains: whose stories go unheard when no ID is present? The film-like intensity of her standoff with law enforcement underscores a broader societal dilemma. When does suspicion become systematic abuse, and who pays the highest cost? Each tense moment, her unwavering gaze, the crowd's collective hush, the officer's immediate readiness to believe Margot, reveals a machine operating on autopilot, set to target those who fit the profile. We're drawn to the screen, hearts pounding, because deep down we recognize that the real danger isn't just one crooked cop or one frightened accuser. It's a structure that enables snap judgments to carry the weight of law. At the core of this story lies a simple yet devastating truth: injustice doesn't need time to root. It just needs enough fear and bias to look away from facts. If Jasmine's badge and legal standing momentarily pierced that shield of ignorance, The entire spectacle forces us to confront what happens when ordinary citizens, lacking her armor, collide with the same system. Her story stands as a condemnation of complacency, an insistence that we cannot rely on good intentions alone to rectify deep-seated biases. The lesson is jarring, that power in the wrong hands can suffocate justice in seconds, and that authority does not always equal righteousness. Ultimately, the tension we feel witnessing her ordeal is the tension of a society teetering on the edge. Do we uphold a fair standard for everyone, or let prejudice continue to direct the spotlight of suspicion? Yet for all the darkness woven into Jasmine's encounter, there is a seed of transformation embedded in her response. She doesn't merely walk away, satisfied that her personal case is resolved. Instead, she repurposes the trauma, seizing the disbelief, the anger, and the frustration, and channels them into a force that can reshape the very system that wronged her. This shift from victim to architect of reform is a crucial dimension of her journey. It punctuates the moral of the story with a powerful call to action, reminding us that despair can be transformed into something constructive. By establishing a training program and insisting on deeper examinations of bias, she defies the narrative that injustices should be quietly filed away after the headlines fade. Her approach isn't about demonizing every officer, it's about confronting a culture of assumptions that silently allows countless innocent people to be dehumanized. In a world so quick to broadcast failures, Jasmine's persistent effort to rebuild trust through education and honest confrontation emerges as a testimony that even within the ugliest moments, the potential for change still burns. And so her victory isn't just a personal vindication, it's a rallying cry for every individual who has ever been dismissed, doubted, or distorted by prejudice. Ultimately, the human lesson woven through Jasmine Crockett's story underscores a dual truth. No one should need a badge to be believed, and everyone deserves a system that protects them rather than suspects them. The tension we feel from the start, watching her move through the airport as an accomplished attorney, yet instantly marked for suspicion by a single accusation, mirrors the tension that millions experience daily without any safety net. Her ordeal begs us to examine how fragile our notions of justice become when color, gender, and status overshadow facts and fairness. It reveals the emotional toll inflicted when entire systems treat certain lives as disposable, while others are presumed safe. We see that Jasmine's triumph, powerful though it may be, is tinged with the sorrow of knowing how close she came to vanishing into handcuffs and a cell like so many before her. She emerges resolute, forging a path of education and advocacy because she cannot escape the haunting thought, what if this happened to someone who couldn't fight back? And indeed, that is the single question that rings louder than any judge's gavel, commanding us to reflect, to re-examine, and to reshape our world. In the end, her fight for truth is bigger than one wrongful arrest. It's a blueprint for awakening a system grown too comfortable in its biases. The lesson is bold and inescapable. Until justice is guaranteed for those without a badge, no badge in the world can truly claim to represent justice. Now that the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's fierce confrontation with systemic injustice have rippled through every corner of the nation, the time for passive outrage and quiet acceptance is definitively over. We can no longer wait for another brutal televised arrest or another quiet, anonymous burial of truth in dusty court dockets, while everyday people, stripped of rank or title, endure the suffocating weight of assumed guilt. It's time to reach beyond the fleeting headlines and hashtag movements, to galvanize communities at every level, forge cross-cutting alliances, and demand policy overhauls that pierce the rotten heart of this failing framework. Picture your mother, your neighbor, or your closest friend standing alone in that airport corridor with no camera and no commanding voice, battered by prejudice and utterly powerless to stop it. Ask yourself if their existence deserves less protection or respect simply because they lack the credentials that spark immediate fear in a corrupt system determined to uphold bias. We must pressure lawmakers into instituting mandatory checks on reckless detentions, champion body cam transparency for all law enforcement encounters, and expand civilian oversight boards with the real power to hold entire departments accountable. We must flood town halls, engage with local council meetings, Write impassioned letters and refuse to let complacency smother the righteous anger that has finally burned awake inside us. Stand by Jasmine's example, not just by sharing her story online, but by echoing her resolve to dismantle the insidious bias that taints our institutions from the inside out. Educate yourself, intervene when others remain silent, and champion the kind of sweeping reforms that ensure no one ever needs a badge to prove they are worthy of dignity. Our collective voice can transform the tremors of her solitary victory into an unstoppable wave of justice. But only if we choose to rise together, here and now, and refuse to stand down. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.